what's wrong with this picture? And there's nothing wrong with this calf necessarily, and when we go on farm, this is very often what we see. So we can see that this calf has access to water and access to concentrate, but there's no milk available. But very likely this calf was provided milk, and the milk allotment is long since finished. So in comparison to this picture, this is very often what we see in calves fed intensively. So it's the kind of milk feeding behavior that they perform throughout the day with milk continuously available. So today I'll give a little bit of a review about what intensified feeding is and how it influences behavior and performance of the calves during the milk feeding stage, and then how it goes on to influence performance later in life. I'd also like to talk about some recent research as far as housing and feeding strategies that come into play when intensified feeding is implemented on farm. So there remain some current considerations and challenges in successfully adopting this feeding program. There are a wide range of milk feeding practices used on dairy farms today. A conventional feeding approach has long been to provide restricted amounts of milk. The conventional milk feeding level around 10% of body weight, which translates to 4 to 5 liters per day. And this restricted milk feeding level supports average daily gain around half a kilogram or less. And this milk feeding program has been popular because it encourages early solid feed intake and then facilitates earlier weaning process. So in comparison to conventional restricted milk feeding, there's increasing adoption of milk feeding programs that provide greater quantities of milk. These milk feeding programs are typically called intensified feeding programs or enhanced feeding or feeding for accelerated growth. So in these programs, calves are provided greater quantities of milk, or in some cases ad libitum access to milk. And calves are able to easily double the amount of milk consumed as typically provided in restricted conventional milk feeding. So in an intensified milk feeding program, calves have average daily gains around 0.75 or over a kilogram per day. This is an example of the differences in milk intake that we see when calves are provided milk ad libitum compared to a conventional restricted milk feeding level. This graph is showing milk intake in liters per day over 6 weeks of milk feeding stage and then 1 week of weaning. So in blue, this is the line for calves consuming milk ad libitum. We can see that their milk intake is increasing over the duration of the milk feeding stage and peaking around 16 liters per day, and they were consuming about 12 liters per day on average across the entire feeding period prior to weaning. In comparison, a conventional approach to milk feeding, these calves were provided 5 liters per day, and it was held constant across the entire milk feeding stage. In this particular study, we saw that calves provided milk ad libitum were gaining weight at about 1.2 kilograms per day compared to calves provided 5 liters per day, and they were gaining 0.5 or 0.6 kilograms. So the intention with intensified feeding programs is to support increased average daily gain prior to weaning. So typical ranges for average daily gain is double conventional feeding rates in intensified feeding programs. But we also see greater structural growth. So girth and hip height is higher with intensified milk feeding. And these calves are more feed efficient, so they have higher weight gain to total dry matter intake ratio. The factor that has the greatest influence on feeding behavior prior to weaning is milk feeding method. And milk feeding level and supplying the calves with more milk, we're having a big impact on their feeding behavior patterns. We can look at their meal frequencies and milk meal durations to see these effects, and also feeding activity over the course of the day when calves are provided more milk. For example, this is some data comparing meal characteristics between calves provided milk ad libitum and calves restricted to 5 liters per day. So when calves had ad libitum access to milk, we can see that they are consuming about 7 meals per day. And when calves are suckling the dam, between 7 and 10 meals per day is pretty typical. So in comparison, with conventional milk feeding, calves are provided restricted amounts of milk, typically in 2 allotments per day. We also saw that calves provided milk ad libitum had longer meals. And this doesn't necessarily mean that they're consuming more milk per meal, but we saw that they consumed their milk more slowly. So they took more pauses during a meal, and they had slower rates of intake. So as a result of these different meal characteristics, calves provided milk ad libitum spend 45 to 60 minutes per day feeding compared to calves provided restricted amounts of milk when they're spending more like 10 or 12 minutes per day feeding. And we can look at this graph to see how differences in milk feeding time are distributed over the course of the day. So this graph is showing the diurnal activity pattern of calves provided different milk levels. So on feeding activity time, minutes per hour, is on the y-axis. So this is how much time they spend consuming their milk. And over the course of the day, this is showing the 24 hours of a day. And this is a snapshot of a day in week 6 of life, in the week prior to weaning. So in blue, this is showing the hourly milk feeding times of calves provided milk ad libitum. So you can see they had a peak in milk feeding time at delivery, and they also spent some minutes per hour feeding over the rest of the day. They had peaks in activity at sunrise and sunset, which is a behavior pattern similar to what we see with suckling calves. In comparison, in red, calves provided restricted amounts of milk had peaks in feeding time at 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. when the milk was delivered, and then they weren't able to feed for the rest of the day. So you might assume that these calves are hungry the rest of the day or motivated to feed. And we can take a look at how much time these calves spent sucking unrewarded on the teat. So this red line is showing unrewarded sucking time for calves provided restricted amounts of milk. And they actually spent more time sucking unrewarded than they did feeding at meal times. And there's also some times at other points in the day when they began sucking on the teat. So this time spent sucking unrewarded is pretty common in conventional milk feeding programs, and other studies have reported frequent unrewarded visits to the feeder. And this says something about how these calves might be hungry, and it also reflects their strong sucking motivation. And this is because feeding method matters. So we know that calves are highly motivated to engage in sucking behavior because the act of sucking has physiological consequences for the calf, stimulating the release of digestive hormones such as gastrin and cholecystokinin. So the motivation to suck exists apart from milk intake, but it is worsened in cases where calves are provided restricted amounts of milk, or if the feeding method doesn't provide an outlet for sucking behavior, such as when calves are provided milk by bucket in conventional milk feeding systems. So in addition to the effects of milk feeding level on feeding behavior, there are some other effects that we can see, for example, in activity. So when we look at play behavior, we see that the amount of time calves spent engaged in running behavior as part of play is associated with energy intake. We also see that calves provided more milk spend more time lying and have fewer vocalizations, suggesting that they may be less stressed. So it's generally considered that intensified feeding programs improve calf welfare, and both through reducing hunger and through allowing the expression of behavior patterns that more closely resemble the natural behavior seen when a calf is suckling the dam. So milk feeding level or intensified feeding obviously has a big impact on behavior during the milk feeding stage. And in some recent work, I was interested in looking at how that might influence the development of behavior patterns that persist after weaning. So are there any differences in meal characteristics arising from different exposure to milk feeding methods earlier in life? So we followed calves provided milk ad libitum or restricted 5 liters per day after weaning. And one thing we saw was that initially after weaning, calves that had been raised in an intensified feeding program had slower rates of intake and smaller meals. The rate of intake can be considered an indicator of feeding motivation. So this suggests that calves raised in a conventional restricted milk feeding program may have developed greater rates of intake, possibly in response to hunger during that period. In this study, we didn't see that any of these differences in behavior persisted beyond that first week after weaning, but it's possible that this kind of behavior and rates of intake and meal frequency could interact with other management and feeding factors. So a lot of the motivation behind adopting intensified feeding programs is interest in optimizing production potential later in life. And quite a bit of work has gone towards this. And some of the first studies were looking at allowing calves ad libitum access to whole milk compared to restricted amounts of milk replacer. And some of the results seen here were reduced age of conception and calving, as well as improved milk production and milk yield later on. Some more recent work has compared different milk replacer feeding levels in an intensified feeding program where they're provided with more milk replacer compared to restricted conventional. And some of the similar results have been seen as far as earlier age at first breeding, as well as some indication of a correlation between pre-weaning average daily gain and milk yield. So these results can be probably summed up most easily. A couple of recent studies have done a meta-analysis of several published data sets looking at the relationship between pre-weaning average daily gain and future milk yield. And these meta-analyses have generally showed that an increase in average daily gain prior to weaning is associated with an increase in milk production in the first lactation. An economic analysis also suggests that the increased cost of feeding calves in an intensified feeding program can be recouped by the first lactation, suggesting that improved performance eventually pays off for these programs. So there are a number of housing and feeding management factors that come into play when implementing intensified feeding on farm. And a couple different questions we can look at, some recent research has gone towards, are how we should wean these calves in intensified feeding programs, what else we should feed them, and how we should house them. So weaning remains a bit of a concern with intensified feeding programs. We need to ask the question, when and how are calves going to start consuming solid feed when they're provided more milk? Conventional milk feeding programs have a focus on encouraging solid feed intake early in life, and this works really well. Calves start consuming more solid food, and then the process of weaning progresses smoothly with consistent weight gain. But when calves are provided more milk, it's very well established that they eat less solid food. So in intensified milk feeding programs, we see that calves have less frequent solid feed meals and shorter solid feed meals. So for example, we've seen that calves provided milk ad libitum might have 1 to 4 meals per day in week 6 of life, compared to calves provided restricted amounts of milk have between 5 and 10 solid feed meals prior to weaning. So big increase in the number of solid feed meals. When calves are consuming less solid food earlier in life, it means that their rumen development is delayed. And we can reduce post-weaning nutrient digestibility. So I showed this graph a few minutes ago showing the feeding activity time for calves provided milk ad libitum or restricted. And this is how much time they spent consuming milk over the course of the day. So we can compare, with these milk feeding times, we can compare how much time calves spend consuming solid feed. So in green, we're looking at how much time the restricted fed calves spent consuming solid food. We can see that they had peaks in solid food feeding time corresponding roughly to when they were consuming milk. So it suggests that they finish their milk meal, and if they're still hungry, they begin consuming solid food. In comparison, calves provided milk ad libitum spent very little time consuming solid food during the day and before weaning. And we can look at how solid feed intake progresses on these different milk feeding programs. So this is concentrate intake in kilograms dry matter per day. And on the left-hand side of the graph, this is the milk feeding stage prior to weaning. So in red, we can see that calves provided restricted amounts of milk were gradually increasing their concentrate intake, whereas calves provided milk ad libitum consumed very little concentrate prior to weaning, and then during weaning quickly increased their intake. And post-weaning intakes were similar. So weaning success, or the potential for calves to gain weight consistently through weaning, really depends on their consuming sufficient solid feed intake early in life to initiate the process of rumen development. And because this variation in weaning really depends on how much solid feed they are consuming prior to weaning, and we see that in different studies, the potential for calves to maintain a body weight advantage as a result of different milk feeding programs really varies. So for example, in a couple different studies, we see differences in weight gain or body weights between 10 and 20 kilograms in the post-weaning stage, resulting from different milk feeding programs. But other studies have seen no difference in post-weaning body weights. So for example, this is the same data set where we were feeding calves milk ad libitum or restricting them to 5 liters. And we're looking at body weight in kilograms over the pre- and post-weaning stage. So before weaning, calves provided milk ad libitum were gaining weight roughly twice as quickly as calves provided 5 liters per day. But we see during weaning, their weight gain plateaued, and their average daily gain was slightly negative during this period. Whereas calves that had been provided restricted amounts of milk continued to gain weight consistently. So in this study, we saw that calves reared in an intensified milk feeding program maintained a body weight advantage through to week 15 of age. But we can see that during weaning, their growth did lag a little bit. So we could have done better to help them gain weight consistently through weaning. So post-weaning performance obviously hinges on a successful transition at weaning. And what's important leading up to weaning is encouraging solid food intake. So weaning methods that encourage solid food intake prior to removal of milk are going to be most effective. And weaning methods that do this are gradual weaning and weaning later in life. So for example, calves weaned according to the same protocol at week 13 compared to week 7 did better because they'd begun consuming more solid food. So we can look at an example of a process of gradual weaning. This is data from the University of British Columbia comparing abrupt weaning off of milk with gradual weaning. So we can see that when calves were weaned abruptly, they didn't really start consuming any solid food until after milk was removed. Milk was sharply dropped off, and then the grain intake sharply climbs. Compared to when calves were weaned gradually, and you can see that grain intake was slowly increasing during the process of milk being stepped down. So in addition to looking at weaning method, it's worth giving some thought to what type of solid feed is being provided for the calves. And with conventional milk feeding programs, the focus has always been on concentrate. And concentrate is really important because it stimulates rumen papillae development through production of VFAs and butyrate in the rumen. So hay, provision of hay, on the other hand, remains a little bit controversial. The concern with providing hay is that it will displace concentrate intake and consequently delay rumen development. But there's been some recent work re-examining providing hay and suggesting there may be some benefits of providing calves access to hay, particularly within the context of feeding programs where they're provided more milk. So for calves provided elevated amounts of milk, and in this case it was 8 liters per day, it's been seen that providing them access to hay actually increases total dry matter intake and may have some benefits for the rumen environment. So calves consuming hay had greater rumen pH, and rumen metabolic development was not delayed, as assessed through blood levels of BHBA. Some work we've done also suggests that calves are somewhat motivated to select a proportion of hay in their diet. So I want to show you the results of a study where we gave calves access to a mixed diet containing chopped hay and grain concentrate. And we wanted to see how they sorted within the diet and what they were selecting in favor of prior to weaning. So the composition of this ration that we offered was 70% concentrate and 30% hay. And through nutrient analysis, we were able to take a look at the composition of the ration they were actually consuming and how they were selecting. What we saw at week 6 of age and the week prior to weaning, they were actually selecting in favor of hay. They were consuming about 35% hay and 65% concentrate, suggesting that hay might be beneficial. They seem to be interested in consuming it. We can compare this to what calves consumed when they were offered hay and concentrate separately. So when they didn't actually have to sort through their ration to consume more hay, they could just eat out of a different bucket. And calves offered hay and concentrate separately consumed about 40% concentrate and 40% hay and 60% concentrate. So we're seeing that regardless of feed presentation, calves were going out of their way to consume hay prior to weaning. So we shouldn't read too much into these particular numbers. The proportion of hay that calves select in their diet varies across studies. It depends on factors like what type of hay is provided, probably what type of concentrate is provided, and milk feeding level. We've seen that selection in favor of hay decreases after weaning, so that suggests that calves are adjusting their dietary selection patterns in response to increased reliance on solid feed for energy in the absence of milk. But it does suggest that hay might be beneficial prior to weaning. So when you look at how calves are housed when intensified feeding programs are implemented on farm, we're seeing often that intensified feeding is adopted hand in hand with group housing. And this is partly due to the availability of computerized calf feeders that allow calves in groups to be fed and monitored individually. It makes it easier to provide them greater quantities of milk. So there are a range of benefits of social housing as far as social development of calves early in life. But it's particularly relevant when talking about intensified feeding to think about how social housing influences intake of solid feed in calves. So social housing allows for the social facilitation of feeding behavior. So calves housed in groups actually consume more solid feed prior to weaning. So this is an example of the solid feed intake as a percentage of body weight before and after weaning for calves housed in pairs or individually. So in green, you can see the intakes of calves housed in pairs and see that they're consuming a little bit more concentrate up until weaning and through weaning, and intake after weaning was similar. We can think about how social factors influencing greater solid feed intake might help with the weaning process in calves fed intensively. So in addition to the effects of social environment on feed intake, we see some other advantages of social housing. Calves in groups vocalize less frequently, suggesting they may be less stressed. Also, calves in groups gain weight more consistently through weaning. And this is partly due probably to increased solid food intake prior to the beginning of weaning, and potentially also due to reduced stress during the weaning process. With computerized calf feeders, it's becoming more common to house calves in groups that are actually quite large, so 10 to 15 calves per feeder. So we could ask the question how competition in that kind of group might affect intake and growth. To begin to look at this, we did a study recently with pair-housed calves. So we looked at pair-housed calves provided one teat, so they weren't able to feed simultaneously and were fed in a somewhat competitive environment, compared with pair-housed calves offered two teats, so that they were able to feed simultaneously. So we saw that even offering just two calves one teat resulted in more frequent displacements. So this was a more competitive environment. We were interested in how calves reared in these environments differing in level of competition, how milk intake was influenced over time. So this graph is showing the milk intake in liters per calf per day over the 7 weeks of the milk feeding stage prior to weaning. So if you take a look at the blue line, this is the intake of calves that were fed in non-competitive pens, so with 2 teats per pen. You can see they're consuming more milk in the first couple weeks of the milk feeding stage compared to calves fed in competitive pens with only 1 teat per pair of calves. So these calves in competitive pens were lagging in the first couple of weeks and then compensating with higher milk intakes in the later weeks of the milk feeding stage. So over the course of the entire milk feeding stage, we saw that milk intake was actually pretty similar between these groups, and weaning weights were not affected. But even this moderate degree of competition in a pair of calves was influencing milk intake over time, with these calves attempting to compensate later on. The other thing we saw was that even when calves were only provided a single teat, so that they weren't able to feed at the same time, that quite a number of their meals overlapped. So this meant that they were standing up at the same time, and they were trying to feed at the same time, and they were taking turns in the teat, so their meals were interspersed. So this suggests that For calves housed in groups, their social factors are fairly influential, and they may struggle to adapt to different feeding schedules, feeding at different times, if they're motivated to feed at the same time and feed together. So they may not be very efficient at using a feeder that only allows a single calf to feed at a time. An interesting thing with some of the work we've done looking at how social housing and competition influences behavior during the milk feeding stage is that some of these behavior patterns appear to persist after weaning. So in the study where we housed calves in pairs with different degrees of competition, we followed them after weaning, all managed similarly after weaning, to see if there were any longer-term differences in behavior. So in these graphs, I'm showing the behavior of calves previously fed in non-competitive pens prior to weaning in blue, and the behavior of calves raised in competitive pens prior to weaning in orange. So on the left-hand side, we can see that calves reared in these competitive pens continue to displace each other more frequently after weaning than calves reared in the non-competitive pens. Calves reared in competitive pens also had slightly fewer synchronized meals, so they're a little bit more likely to get up and feed alone when the other calf was sleeping, and we saw that they had greater rates of intake. So all of these measures kind of agree with the idea that these calves are continuing to be more competitive, and that increased degree of competition in the environment, the more frequent displacements of the teat, was shaping some of the meal patterns we saw as far as greater rates of intake. So this behavior is interesting. We saw this persist at 6 weeks after weaning. And it'd be interesting to think if some of these behavior patterns persist later in life, how they might influence behavior of the lactating cow. And when cows, when there's increasing competition at the bunk, that influences feeding behavior and encourages larger, less frequent meals and greater rates of intake, feeding patterns which are generally detrimental for rumen health. So we don't really want to be encouraging this persistent competition. So it's worth considering how long these types of behaviors might persist. So to summarize, intensified feeding obviously has a lot of impact on growth early in life and behavior patterns, and can be very beneficial and provides a lot of opportunity to optimize long-term production. There remain some considerations when implementing it on farm, and generally it comes down to wanting to make sure that you're going to carry that advantage after weaning, which can be done through encouraging solid feed intake, which depends on weaning strategy, the type of feed provided, and how the calves are housed. And in general, I think we can look to behavior to better understand how best to feed and house these calves to maximize their longer-term potential.